The hotel was dying, and like all dying thing, it exhaled its decay slowly, all around itself, from the peeling wallpaper and chipped paint to the way the light in the lobby constantly flickered, as if it too sensed the end of things as they were. I don't know why I stayed. Most of the staff had moved on to better ventures, dropping like flies as time went by, when it became apparent the hotel was on its last leg, and nothing would be done to save it. I had only worked there for 3 months. I could have easily started off somewhere else all over again. So no, I don't know why I stayed. Maybe it was a sensation I had when silence engulfed the hotel at night, heavy and familiar, like a slightly eerie blanket. Or maybe it was the way the whole building faintly smelled of rain, even when sun baked the cracked pavement outside. There's a certain comfort in small discomforts, I think. A sense of familiarity that makes even the bleakest things feel peaceful. That was this place in a nutshell for me. The hotel was dying. I knew that much. Fewer guests each month. More rooms sealed off because the damp air had made the wooden floorboard sag, the wallpaper peel off, or the carpet smell of mold. All things the owner, a person I had never met or talked to myself, seemed uninterested in fixing. But the night shift was easy work, and no one bothered me. I liked the stillness that came with the job. Until the birds came. 3 of them arrived on a Sunday evening, just before dusk. They sat silently, perched in clusters along the power lines and the rusting fence that bordered the hotel's back lot. I couldn't tell you if there were crows, ravens, blackbirds, or something entirely different. All I know is that nowadays I can't look at a bird with black feathers without feeling like I'm going to be violently sick. Their beady black eyes seem to follow me everywhere, tracking my movements when I walk to the creaky gates to clock in for my shift, or when I stepped out under the stars for my usual cigarette break. While unsettling, it was easy to convince myself there was nothing to it. I knew birds could be really smart, and maybe those ones were trying to pick between friend or foe when they looked at me. I smoked my cigarette on the crumbling stoop, watching them shuffle and preen. I even left a few crumbs of the sandwich I planned to have later in the night on the steps as an offering. I hoped they would judge me a friendly face after that, but they made no sound, no movement, even when I grunted and got up to return inside. Just sat there, staring with tilted heads. The next day, 3 more had joined them. They covered the short power line between the 2 leaning poles now, like a black tide moving and swaying softly with the wind. When I clocked in for the night, I heard one of them whistle something soft, almost melodic, a bird song like none I had heard before. It was beautiful, in all honesty, hauntingly so, when standing in a place that barely hung to whatever life it had left. I had the fleeting thought then that the birds, like everything else, would be one of the small discomforts that would slowly blend into the melancholic painting this place always seemed to be to me. Something more than just me to accompany these waltz to their end. It was silly, I know, but being in the hotel at night always made the pretentious poet inside me perk its head up. That was the night she checked in. The hotel had been empty for almost 2 weeks. Not a single client in sight. I rarely saw anyone even when we had occupied rooms. We weren't in the middle of the city, and people rarely felt the need to wander after dark around here, so I had gotten used to entertaining myself without having to be too aware of my surroundings. That probably explains why I hadn't heard her enter, or even the click of her heels against the checkered tiles. One minute I was leaning down to dust a cobweb under the front desk, and the next she was there, just standing inside the lobby. Her hair hung dark and sleek over one shoulder, framing a face too pale to seem healthy. She wore a long black coat that went down all the way to her ankles, and she looked way too good for this place. Too stylish, too wealthy, too proper. She even wore those shoes with the red bottom that I could never remember the name of. To me, those always made me think of someone that had stepped in blood, staining the bottom of their shoe. But to the regular people, the ones that didn't enjoy spending all of their nights alone in a decaying place, rumored to be haunted in new inventive ways every other week, I knew this meant she had a lot of money to throw away. "I need a room," she said, her voice low and lilting. She didn't smile. It sounded as beautiful as the birdsong nonetheless. I fumbled towards the old computer, barely remembering the protocol. I had never checked anyone in since I had started working at the hotel. I knew how to. I was giving the crash course, but Teresa, the 60-something woman who took care of the day shift and had apparently worked at this hotel since she was even younger than me, had always been the one handling arrivals. I finally managed to pull up the system, but the computer was lagging again, the cursor crawling across the screen like it was moving through inches of mud. Unsurprising, when most of the cables running through the building were probably stripped raw at this point. She didn't seem to mind the wait, however. She just stood there, still as a statue, her dark eyes glancing toward the window at my back. That gave a perfect view of the birds perched on the power line, silent once again. "They like it here," she said softly. I blinked, confused. "The birds?" She didn't answer, just took out her ID from her purse and slid it on top of the desk towards me. I had barely started entering information into the system and hadn't even thought about asking for it yet. But I guess she was used to this song and dance already, so I took it with a nod and a polite smile she didn't return. The photo was faded, the text smudged almost to nothing. I squinted at it, but still couldn't decipher the name. "You're lucky, you know." Her lips barely moved as she spoke, almost making me jump out of my skin. They only ever go where they're needed. Her strange tirade about the birds made me completely forget about her illegible ID. For some reason, looking at her, listening to her beautiful somber voice, made the hair at the back of my neck raise. I was never good at being around people, even less so beautiful women, and I simply chucked it as me being awkward and anxious. I left most of the check-in form empty, handed her the key to room 304, one of our only rooms left to be inhabitable, and left it at that. She turned her back as soon as she had the key in hand, without a word or a smile, and I watched her ascend the staircase, her heels clicking rhythmically against the creaking wood. This was the last peaceful night I remember spending at the hotel. The last night where everything felt quiet and still as I had learned to love them. Before the scratching started and my night shift turned nightmarish. It started the next evening, quiet but all too noticeable when you are as used as I was to the complete silence of the place. It seemed to come from the walls behind the front desk, faint at first, like a loose branch dragging against the siding. There was no way a branch could make any noise noticeable from the inside, with how thick the walls of the building were. Plus, there were no trees that close to the outer walls to begin with, but the scratch, was quickly getting on my nerves, so I stepped outside to check nonetheless. All I saw were even more birds than the night before, some of them forced to perch on the gutter lining the roof, barely holding itself together under the added weight because the power cable had become too crowded. It went back inside, trying to focus on the hum of the vending machine instead of the sound creeping through the walls. The scratching grew louder as the hours dragged on, moving now above me, then below, then behind the desk again. It felt like something burrowing, clawing its way up and down the floors from inside the walls themselves. It was unnerving. Like I said, I had gotten accustomed to the silence. I had learned to love it even, so any sound disturbing that peace would have felt foreign to me in the dead of night, but this one even more so. It was insidious, creeping. It made me uneasy regardless of what caused it, and despite the state of the hotel, uneasy was the feeling I had never felt during my shifts before. I sat there for hours, humming to myself to try and drown the infernal noise. I didn't see the woman in 304 coming back from errands or climbing down to complain about the scratching, and unsurprisingly didn't check in any new client either. When my shift neared its end, for the first time in the last few months, I was more than happy to see the first ray of sunlight filter through the stained glass above the double doors. My nerves were raw and my ears kept ringing with phantom noises, even after I had walked out. When Teresa met me at the entrance to start the day's shift, I told her about the scratching. She laughed, said the rats were probably getting bold again. But even though I didn't know the woman very well, something about her wide smile felt forced, empty of the amusement she displayed, like she didn't quite believe what she was saying either. I don't know if, one way or another, Teresa knew about what was about to happen before I did. I never tried to find her to ask afterwards, but thinking back on it now, I wouldn't be surprised. The woman stayed in room 304 for 3 days. I never saw her leave. I only knew she was still there because the system hadn't updated with her departure, and strangely enough, because I could occasionally catch the faint smell of her perfume drifting down the staircase at the start of my shifts. Something sharp and floral, like jasmine left too long in water. An enjoyable smell until you tried to pay too close attention to it, catching the hints of wrongness that accompanied it. The birds had multiplied, a little more of them joining their brethren each day. They had to scatter all over the place to even find space to perch now, between the power line, the windowsills, the gutter lining the roof, and one of them even finding its spot on the roof of the lone abandoned car in front of the building that had been there for as long as I could remember. I had tried as hard as I could, and for as long as I could, to ignore it. Nature was weird that way, and birds like to perch on things, forming groups during their migration, or so I had learned after a night of furious Googling on this subject. But there was something not right about so many similar birds showing up at the same time, when I had rarely seen more than a few of them croak and pass by until then. I knew black birds were seen as an omen, a warning of death. The internet, again, had told me so. Some small, whimsical part of my brain wanted to believe they had come to see the hotel die, to sing that bird song of theirs at its funeral, to celebrate the life well lived of a building that had stood the test of time for generations before finally caving in under its old age. But even birds weren't that smart, and spending too long trying to figure out exactly led and kept them here made me more paranoid and uneasy by the second. The intermittent scratching, of course, didn't help. And then there was the blood. I was taking the stairs up to the second floor for my daily, though usually useless, scan of the corridors and empty rooms when I saw the first smear of it just at the edge of the handrail. At first, I thought it was rust. Hints of it had appeared on almost every metallic surface at this point, but it streaked wetly when I swiped my thumb across it, painting my skin in a small red smudge. I wiped it on my jeans and kept climbing, concerned. It wasn't my blood, and Teresa looked perfectly fine when I saw her at dusk. No cuts, bruises, or bandages. Unless we had squatters, it was pretty easy to deduce it was the blood of the woman in 304, but I didn't want to jump to conclusion, so I kept looking at the handrail as I climbed, searching for more drops of it against the railing. By the time I reached the third floor, I had found 3 more smears of blood. Walking down the corridor leading to 304, the smell became unmistakable. The signature jasmine I had learned to equate to her mixed with a coppery scent that made my tongue go dry and my stomach turn. People can say they don't know the odor of blood, but the truth of the matter is, when faced with it, it becomes instantly second nature to recognize it. I hurriedly knocked, suddenly worried that something might have happened to the stranger. I hadn't seen much blood at all, but the smell of it had me in knots. "Ma'am," my voice shook. "Are you okay?" No answer. The door wasn't locked. I didn't like the idea of entering without permission, but it felt safer to get reprimanded for it than to let someone bleed out when I could have prevented it at the time. I knew I was overreacting, but things had turned from weird to weirder too fast in the span of a few days, and my mind struggled to keep a grip on reality. I tilted the doorknob. It swung open with the softest push, and I saw her. She was standing by the window, looking out at the birds gathered there. Her coat laid abandoned on the untouched bed, and her pale skin looked gaunt and gray under the moonlight. It made it even easier to notice the red smeared all over her fingers and the palms she had pressed against the glass, drops of it slowly trailing down the length of her forearm before dripping from her elbow and onto the floor at her bare feet. "Ma'am?" I tried again, more alarmed now than ever, but she didn't turn around. Her breath fogged the pain as she whispered something I couldn't hear. From where I stood, I couldn't see if she was hurt, if there were any cuts on her. All I could see was the blood now forming a tiny puddle seeping under the sole of her feet, and the blurry reflection of her expressionless face in the window. I took one step forward, only one. I wanted to check on her, but I was also incredibly weirded out. Nothing about this felt right. The situation, the woman, even the air in the room somehow felt wrong. The floor creaked under my weight, and the sound made her laugh suddenly, a soft broken noise that sent a shiver crawling up my spine. "Do you hear them yet?" she murmured, her voice barely more than a breath. I'm not ashamed to say that I backed out of the room and walked back down to my desk as fast as I could. It took all my self-control not to simply run there. Something was wrong with this woman, mentally. I felt bad for leaving her if she was hurt, but it's difficult for anyone to understand how heavy and suffocating the atmosphere was at that moment. All I could smell was the blood and jasmine, and the sound of her broken laugh and nonsensical question seared themselves in my brain. And for a second, standing there, I was blindingly scared. I didn't want to go back upstairs after that. Even while scanning the corridors, I started to purposefully skip the third floor altogether. I knew the woman was still there, in 304. She never seemed to leave the room at all, at least not during the night, and the rotting sweetness of her perfume had started to carry hints of copper in it now, as if the smell of the blood I had seen on her hands that day had clung to her. It was nauseating, and for the first time I contemplated quitting just to get a reprieve from ever having to smell it again. The birds were everywhere too. They crowded the parking lot, the lobby windows, the roof, and the gate. One of them had even tried flying in the hallway just before the front desk, but I had opened the door at dusk. They never moved an inch when I approached, not even those I had to walk over to get to the door. They just stared with their beady eyes like they were waiting for something, and as curious as I might have been before, I really didn't want to know what anymore. I stopped going out for my cigarette breaks to avoid them. The scratching in the walls had grown louder too, more insistent. I adored the silence and the stillness before, but now I had to take earbuds with me at work and use my music to drown out the sound, else it would drive me up to the wall. Every day Teresa swore she heard none of it. I didn't even know if I could trust her or not. Hell, I barely trust my own senses anymore. And despite the music almost constantly blaring in my ears, in between songs, I would sometimes hear that broken laugh echoing down the staircase, always followed by that one phrase, "Do you hear them yet?" On the 6th night of her stay in 304, the power went out. The emergency lights flickered weakly, casting the whole room downstairs in sickly red glow that did nothing to appease how furiously freaked I had now become every time I was at work. The scratching was almost deafeningly loud now, not just in the walls, but in the vents, ceiling, and beneath the floor. It was impossible to tell where it was coming from. All I knew was that it wasn't those damn rats Teresa had tried to blame. And then I heard a scream, blood-curdling and terrifying. I knew exactly where it came from, the only room it could come from, and I hated myself for hesitating. But for a second, I really had to ask myself if it was worth it going up those stairs. But no matter how scared and paranoid I had become, no matter how much I believed something to be very, very wrong with the woman in 304, I wasn't heartless. After a scream like that, I had to check up on her, disregarding every single of my instincts telling me to run the other way. I grabbed the flashlight from behind the desk and climbed the stairs, the beam trembling against the yellowed wallpaper. By the time I reached the 3rd floor, the smell of blood was so thick it felt like it coated my tongue, making me gag, tears forming at the corner of my eyes. There was no jasmine there, just pure copper, the scent stronger with each step I took towards her room. Her door was open. This time, it wasn't respect or politeness that was keeping me from peeking in, but unaltered terror. I didn't want to see what was in there. I didn't want to see her. And more importantly, I didn't want her to see me. But I had gone this far. Steeling myself, I held my breath, hoping it would momentarily get rid of the awful stench, and I leaned to the side to look inside room 304. It was empty. No woman, no belongings, not even the furniture that had always been there. Just the walls, slick with thick blood from top to bottom, rapidly pooling on the floor in a puddle that could almost reach my ankle. Feathers clung to them like wet leaves, scattered all over the four walls, rustling with the wind coming from the open window. Not open, broken. Tens of bird corpses laying under it, blood and feathers mixing with shards of glass, as if the birds themselves had rammed into the window to make it inside, only to die there. From outside, more of them stared at me with their beady, soulless eyes, unblinking, unmoving. The scratching worsened, making me jump. It sounded so close, like it was right behind me. Not against the floor or the wall, but right next to my ear. I don't remember moving, but I did. I was in a state of shock, I think. Terrified, unbelieving, unable to think through my own actions anymore. So, I turned around. She was right there, inches from me. I think I screamed, but the birds all started croaking, singing, batting their wings in a cacophony so complete that I don't even remember hearing my own scream, or the sound of my flailing heartbeat. Her face was all wrong, her mouth stretched too wide. Her eyes seemed as black and soulless as the birds. Blood dripped from her arms, her eyes, her mouth. But she wasn't in pain. She was laughing. That god-awful broken sound. And then she just whispered to me, "It's time. Do you hear them yet?" I don't remember running, but I must have. I woke up at home, the flashlight still clutched in my shaky hands, and dried blood coating my shoes and even the bottom of my jeans. I never went back to work after that. I didn't call the owner. I didn't reach out to Teresa. I didn't even try to go back one more time to see if I had imagined it all. Because as impossible as it all sounds, I knew I hadn't, and the blood on my clothes was proof enough. It took me copious amounts of therapy to stop waking up, screaming every time I closed my eyes, and even when I thought I was starting to forget, to rebuild some normalcy into my daily life without my family constantly acting as if I was one step away from a mental breakdown. It seemed the hotel wasn't quite done with me. A week ago, I stumbled upon an article online mentioning that the hotel had simply died. It had apparently crumbled onto itself, the structure giving way under its own weight, until there was very little left but rubble. And according to the article, it all happened the night I saw the blood, the night I fled the scene. I don't know what happened. I spent a lot of time thinking about it. The birds, the woman, her question, and ultimately the hotel's demise. I've never managed to make sense of it, and for my well-being, I've stopped trying. But it would be lying if I said that. Sometimes when I close my eyes and I'm about to fall asleep, I don't hear her lilting voice in my head asking me, "Do you hear them yet?"